So here's an interesting question. Does this switch need to have a case to handle null? Well, if theme mode can return null, then it does, and this switch is broken. Can it? Wouldn't it be nice if the compiler could just tell me whether I need to worry about theme mode being null or not? Well, the new null safety feature that we are releasing as part of Flutter 2.0 is designed to solve just this kind of problem for our developers. Null safety lets the tooling keep track of what things can be null for you, making development in Flutter easier, faster, and more reliable. So today I'm going to show you what it's like to migrate an app to null safety. This isn't an intro to null safety, so if you're not familiar with the feature, some things will be new to you, but don't worry, you'll get the basic idea. So the app I'm going to migrate is the Rally app from the Flutter Gallery demo app. It's a pretty full-featured app. We can take a look in here. We can click around. We see it has a bunch of animations. It has a bunch of charts. So, non-trivial app. There's about 9,000 lines of code in this as I have it currently running. The thing I want to point out here is this little message down in the terminal window that says that we are running with unsound null safety. So what's that about? Well, basically, this app is running a version of the Flutter framework that has been ported over to null safety, but the app itself is not yet null safe. So we're running a mix of null safe and non-null safe code. That's fine. We built technology into Dart to make this work, but it means that the app doesn't get the full benefits of null safety, and the framework can't rely on the app not to pass null where it's not allowed to. That's what we mean by unsound null safety. We can't quite trust it. So what we need to do today is to get this app running with full sound null safety. And to do this, we're going to use a migration tool that the Dart team has built to make this easier. So let's give it a try. So if we go over here to our terminal window, we can run the migration tool directly from our terminal. So if we run Dart migrate, it's going to give us a little printout here, which tells us some helpful documentation, which is very useful to read. And we'll tell you lots of powerful ways to use the tool and tell you more about how to use null safety as well. The tool is going off and it is looking at your code and it is analyzing it to figure out a bunch of things that it needs to know about it in order to migrate it to null safety. So it's looking at the code. And it's giving us an error. So something went wrong. What did we do here? Okay, so we're getting a bad state. We're getting an error that says that the package has unmigrated dependencies. So what's going on with that? Well, this is the first thing that the migration tool is going to do for you. We really encourage our developers not to migrate their code before all of their dependencies have been migrated. Waiting for your deps to be migrated makes your migration experience much more reliable and helps you have a good experience with it. And the migration tool is trying to keep you on the rails by checking this for you. So we need to fix this before we get started. So how do we fix this? Well, we need to update all of our dependencies. We need to change the packages that we depend on to be null safe versions. And the tool that we use for this is the tool that understands packages, which is pub, okay? So we have built into pub a new mode for the pub outdated command. So if we run flutter pub outdated with -- mode equals null safety, we will get a bunch of information that's very useful for knowing whether or not we are ready to migrate to null safety. Okay, so we're running pub outdated and we get some information that tells us a whole bunch of stuff about the status of our dependencies of the packages. So what are we looking at here? Well, on the left side, we have a column that says the name of all of the packages that we are currently using for which the current version is not null safe. And you can tell that because if you look under current, that column shows us the current version that we are using. And there's a little X next to the version that means that it is not yet null safe. It has not been migrated. That package has not been migrated. And you shouldn't be migrating your app unless all of the packages you depend on are null safe. Well, maybe there's a new version of the package which is null safe because the Dart team has been out migrating lots of stuff to get it ready. And in fact, if we look at this, if we looked under the resolvable column, we see that both of these packages have a version listed with a check mark next to it. And that little check mark is telling us that this version that is listed here is null safe. The resolvable column is telling us the latest versions that we can get that are mutually compatible, that we will actually be able to get a pub solve for. There may be a more recent version listed under latest, but for some reason it is not compatible with something else that we have in there. Okay, so resolvable is what we're going to focus on. And if we want to migrate, because we are apparently able to migrate, what we need to do is we need to copy over these latest resolvable versions into our pub spec and update the dependencies on the packages. Okay, so we're starting here with Shrine Images, and we're going to go to Shrine Images and update it to point to this latest null safe version. And we will do the same for URL Launcher here. It has -null safety in its name because it's a null safety pre-release. It hasn't been published and stable yet, but it is available as a pre-release. Okay, so I've updated my pub spec here. And now if I run flutter pub get, that will go off and it will get me these new versions of these packages, download them, and it will get it ready to run again. And if we run our outdated command again just to check, what we should see is that there is nothing listed anymore among the packages that are not yet available. So we can see here that all of our dependencies, both direct dependencies and dev dependencies, all of them support null safety. So that tells us that we are now ready to migrate. So now we can go back and try again. Okay, so this is going off and doing some analysis. So what is it going to do? So the first thing I'm going to tell you that it's going to do, or not going to do, is it's not going to change the code that we have on our disk. So the migration tool is designed to make essentially its own virtual copy of your code, pretend to migrate it, and then it's going to give us a preview of what it will do once we choose to apply the migration. So this allows us to look at the choices that it's making and possibly reconsider if we want to accept those choices directly or do something to change what choices it's making. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Okay, so we've made a little further here. We're not getting our error anymore about seeing missing migrated dependencies. It's generating a bunch of suggestions. It's generating the modified code, and then it's spinning up a little web server and giving us locally on our disk here on our own machine, and then it's giving us an address that we can hit to actually get a preview of the code, the way it will look once we migrate it. Okay, so this is the migration tool. So let's take a little look around the migration tool. If we look over on the left, what we see here is a skeleton view of our code layout of our app. This is the app code over here. And there are little checkboxes showing which files we're choosing to migrate now. By default, you're going to migrate everything. But if for whatever reason you want to only migrate part of your app, so for example, you want to split part of it off so you can send it off in bite-sized chunks to your reviewers and be nice to your reviewers, you can choose to deselect certain parts and select other parts. Again, as with packages, we recommend that you choose to migrate the sort of roots of your package first and then move in a waterfall fashion through the dependencies even within your app if you don't migrate it all at once. But the migration tool, the preview pane here, allows you to choose which things you're going to migrate. Okay? And if you click on any one of these files, in the middle here, in this middle pane, we will see a preview of what the code will look like after we run the migration. And then there's a little bit of more information over on the right that I'm gonna get to in a minute. So the first time through this tool, I'm going to do a couple things with this, but the first time through, I want to just see what happens if we just accept the changes as the migration tool proposes them with no modifications. And so to do that, or at any point, if I want to accept the code in its current state, I can push the Apply Migration button. Okay? Applying a migration is actually going to edit the code that is on my disk. The tool is going to go off. If I click that, it's going to say, do you really want to do this? And if you say OK, then you will see down here in your terminal window that it has applied the migrations. It has migrated 48 files. And if we do a quick git diff, we'll see now that there's a whole bunch of changes that have been made to our code. And if we go over to our IDE, we can actually see, if we go up and we click on one of these files here, we might see some changes. So for example, some @required things became required and so on. We actually also see though that we have a static error. Okay, so this is the first thing I want to point out about this. The migration tool is not perfect. It's not putting us out of business yet. It does a lot of the mechanical work for you, but it will sometimes get things wrong, or it will sometimes make choices that are not exactly what you would have made if you were migrating the code by hand. The real strength of the tool is doing sort of the mechanical data flow work for you, where you have something which is nullable assigned to something else which is nullable and chasing that down. And here it's gone a little off the rails. So let's see, we only have one error, so let's see how much work is left for us to do if we were running the migration this way. If we go in here, we can see that what it's complaining about is that we have a variable match, and the inferred type of match is string question, and it's being assigned to the parameter of this demo page constructor. And we can see that this demo page constructor, it's a field formal, and it has been migrated to be non-nullable. And yet we are passing a string question as a nullable string. We're passing a nullable value, and that's not allowed. Okay, so this is somewhere where the tool went a little bit off the rails. Basically, this was already marked as at required, and usually the tool assumes that things which are required are not nullable, because that's what they usually are. If we change our mind and we make this nullable, that's fine. This is good so far. That fixes the original error we had, but it introduces a new error because there are other places that this thing is assigned, and now we have to chase through and mark all of the places that this data flows through as also being nullable. And this is the work that the migration tool would otherwise be doing for you, right? It would be doing the work of chasing through all of these places that nullable value reaches and marking them nullable for you. So that's why using the migration tool in general is going to save you a lot of work, because it does a lot of this mechanical stuff. And we can see now that that we have actually that we now have no errors. So we can go over to our app here and we can quit out of it and we can restart it. That's going to take a minute to start up. So let me just point out here a couple more things around here. We have a bunch of informationals now that weren't there before. So what's going on with that? Well, one thing we can see is that there are a whole bunch of assertions which are now not necessary, right? These were assertions that were previously asserting that things that should not be null, that are not allowed to be null, were not actually passed a null value. Well, now that we've migrated this to null safety, the static analysis, the tooling, is sufficient to prevent this from happening. So that the system is telling us that these assertions are essentially dead. When we were running in unsound mode, we might have wanted to keep these assertions around because unmigrated code could violate the guarantees of null safety and still flow null through here. But now that we've migrated this fully to null safety, we don't need these assertions anymore. Another cool thing, if we look in here, if you remember when I started out, I asked the question of whether this case, this switch statement here, needed to handle null. And we can see actually now that the migration tool has figured out for us that we do. In fact, theme mode can be nullable. It has been migrated to be nullable. And I looked through this code and actually found that yes, null can flow to this location. It turns out that won't crash the app because there's some default logic here. But it's a latent bug in this code that was found by null safety. And if I was editing with this code, I would have been told this right up front. So that's one of the really nice things about working with null safe code that I hope you find valuable. Okay, so we're loading up the app here. It's taking a little bit of time. We have to do a full rebuild. But if we give it a minute. Okay, and we are up and running. So the first thing I want to point out is that we are in fact running with full sound null safety. We've got this little message tells here, says that we have been successful. And now all of the code in our app is soundly null safe, and the compiler and ourselves can trust that no null values flow to places where they shouldn't, okay? And if we click around in the app here, we actually can see it's running quite fine. That's not always the case. It's possible that you will get new runtime errors. Maybe you added a null assertion operator in a place that it wasn't supposed to, or any of a various number of small things. But in this case, we seem to have ended up in a pretty good spot, and the code is running just fine. So that's pretty cool, right? We basically just took an app, and with one push of a button plus 3 small edits, we got this entire 9,000 lines of Dart code up and migrated and running with full null safety. And it took us, maybe 10, 15 minutes here. And I'm not cheating, by the way. I didn't pull this app down and do a whole bunch of work beforehand to make this easy. This is, I cut out some of the other pieces of the app that I didn't want to work on to get it down to 9,000 lines. But other than that, I just ran this and we're running. So this is really a legitimate example of what it can be like to migrate your code. But we also saw that it didn't necessarily do everything right. And I also will say that the tool is going to be more conservative than you might choose to be. It is trying to get things up and running, and it is trying to minimize the number of things that it makes nullable. But where it has to make a choice, it will sometimes make a choice to make something nullable that you, because you know a little bit more about your app, would be able to make non-nullable. And so if you want to do a careful migration of your code up front, right, you might want to audit the changes that the tool is going to make and guide it to a better result. Fortunately, the tool supports an interactive workflow for doing this, which allows you to tune the output. And this is one of the I think the more powerful ways of using the tool. So we're going to go back and try this again using that interactive workflow. Okay, so let's give it a try. Okay, so if we go back over here to our terminal, we can reset ourselves back to clean state so we can try this again using the interactive workflow. We tried it once just sort of accepting everything that the migration tool suggested to us and then fixing up anything. Now I want to walk through it again, taking a careful look at the choices that it's going to make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run that tool again. Okay. And if you recall again, this tool is not going to directly change the code that we have on the disk. It's going to go off and develop its own little view of the world and propose it to us in a preview package. When we use an interactive workflow, we're going to spend time using the tool in our IDE to understand the choices that it's making and to guide the choices that it's making. So how do we guide the choices? Well, there's two ways we can do that. One is we can actually refactor our code so that it's more compatible with null safety. And the other is we can add explicit hints in a way that I'll show you in a minute to the code to guide the tool to a better result. And that's the one I'm going to focus on here, okay? Using hints to guide the output of the tool to get it to produce exactly what we want. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so it's getting its stuff spun up here. And if we take again, remember it's got a little web server, and we take the URL it gives us and just open it up in our browser. And we're once again back into this preview tool, and we can look, we can start poking around in here. So this time I want to focus a little more on using the tool and all of the powerful things that the tool provides for us. So I talked about how in the center here we have our preview pane. And this preview pane is again showing us the way the code is going to look after it's migrated. On the disk is the code that currently exists unmigrated, and in this preview pane is the code as it will exist once we migrate. And you can see that because actually it's highlighted here the changes that it's proposing to make in the preview pane. So if we look at each of these, it's adding questions to these type, meaning this is becoming a nullable type. This is a field that it thinks is potentially going to be nullable. And it's also listing over here in this upper right hand corner, it's listing by category each of the changes it's going to make. So we can see in this file here, it's making quite a few changes. It's proposing to add a lot of non-null assertion operators. We can click on them over here and it'll take us there. These non-null assertion operators are places where we have a nullable thing that we know by invariant is now not null, and we want to extract out the non-null value with a non-null assertion operator. A null check operator. So there's a whole bunch of those in there. I don't want to focus on them right now. So what I suggest when you're using the interactive workflow is that you focus on the types that have been made nullable. So down here, there's a list of just 4 types, 4 places where it has taken a type and made it nullable. The reason I recommend focusing on this is that the choice of nullability in the types is what drives all of the other changes that it makes. All of those null check operators that it's adding because of the choices that it made about nullability. So once you've figured out what the right nullability is for the types, all of those null check operators, you might want to check them, but they basically are mechanically added. They're mechanical. And this is, the power of the tool is that it will do that mechanical work for you. So let's take a look at it. So if we look here, we've got these 4 fields. It is proposing to make them nullable. So is that the right choice? maybe I know a lot about this code, so I can just say right off the hand, yes or no, that's great. In this case, I'm actually not that familiar with this code. I just pulled this down off of GitHub, so I'm using the tool and using my IDE to explore this. And the tool gives us some very powerful tools. It gives us some very powerful techniques for figuring out why it is making the choices that it's making. So if we click on one of these, we can see down in this right-hand pane, down in the bottom right, a stack of the reasoning that led the tool to make the decision that it made. It's essentially telling you what flow of control and data through the program led it to decide that this should be a nullable variable. And if we walk back through that flow, we can reconstruct very quickly and without having to do a lot of exploring in the code or debugging why it's made it nullable and whether we agree with its reasoning. So let's do that. If we go over here to this little pane here, and we start clicking on the points in the file, well, the top of it is just pointing to the actual field. And then the second thing is saying, well, this field is set in the constructor as a field formal parameter. And this is the constructor that it is set in. Then if we walk back one level, we get to the call to the constructor that is causing it to believe that this should be nullable. Okay? So it's looking here and it's saying open controller is set by being a parameter to the animations constructor here in this other file. And if we walk back one step, we can see that it has decided that in this other state file, open controller is going to be a nullable parameter. Okay, that seems very reasonable, except if we look in this init, this is part of the init state, it's an init state submethod. Once we get here to this point, the assertions tell us that these four fields will always be non-null. So in fact, the animations constructor, even though it looks like it is accepting a nullable value, will never get null. So here is a place where we would like to change the output of the tool by overriding its behavior. We'd like to come in here and say, no, we don't want you to make this nullable. We want you to make this non-nullable. Okay? And the way we can do that, one of the simplest ways, is we can actually use these two buttons that the tool gives to us to add a question mark hint, which means make it nullable. Well, we don't need that one because this is already nullable. Or the exclamation point hint, which means no, make this non-nullable, which is what we want because we want to change it. We want to override it. So we hit that button, and what we see is we see a little comment with a bang in it showing up here on the code. Key point here. This is the one point up until the point that we apply the migration that the tool is actually editing the code on the disk. So if we go over to our IDE, we can see that this IDE, which is looking at the code on the disk, is showing us that this comment has actually been added into the code. And in fact, if we want to, we can add the comments out here. I want all four of these to be non-nullable, so I can just go ahead and edit it directly in my IDE. If I wanted to, I could check this code into GitHub. I could spread out this migration over a long time period by just adding annotations and incrementally working on it. And all of these have no effect on the existing code, but they guide the migration tool to a better result. Okay. So if we go back to the tool now, we can rerun the tool. There's this rerun with changes button that we're going to hit. And when we hit that, it's going to look at the comments that have been added, look at any changes to the code, any refactoring you did, and it's going to recompute the set of suggested changes that it's going to make to your code. So it is doing exactly the same work. And our hope here by adding these non-nullability assertions is that we're going to make the rest of this code cleaner, right? Okay, so this is the output. If you recall, when we first came into this file, there were a whole bunch of null check operators proposed to be added this, and those were all driven by the fact that these four fields were nullable. Now that we have made them nullable, now that we've overridden the choices of the tool, it is not suggesting to add those because they're not needed anymore. So by auditing this and making a few small changes to its choices of non-nullability, we've ended up in a point where the final emitted code is much cleaner. That's what I mean by an interactive work with the tool. We work with the tool to help get it to a better point. It does all the mechanical work of figuring out what flows from these decisions that we make about what things are nullable. Okay? One more example here I want to show of a different kind of tool we can use. So if we go to featurediscovery.dart here, we go into a little bit, we'll see another example of a code pattern which is very common in Flutter, which is a state. This accompanies a stateful widget, and it's a state class. There's a very common pattern here where state classes tend to have fields which are not set in the constructors, but they are set in the init state method. Often, but not always, those fields are never actually intended to be used as null. They just happen to be set a little bit late. Well, Dart null safety has a new feature called late fields, which is exactly intended to support this kind of pattern where you set something later. You don't set it initially to a non-null value, but once you set it, you never reset it to null. So often we want to look at our state classes to see, is this a good place to use a late variable? Okay, so how do we figure that out? Well, I'm going to look at this animations and these overlay fields here, both of which the tool is choosing to mark as nullable. If we look at the reasoning stack here, it's actually not that helpful this time, because basically it's just telling us this field is not initialized, so I don't know what to do with it. Sometimes that means we may want to refactor the code to initialize the code in the constructor, but in this case, in this state pattern, we don't get to do that. But what we can do is we can go over here to our IDE, and we can actually start looking around a little bit to figure out whether it is necessary to make these things nullable. There's nothing wrong with making them nullable, but let's see. So if we look at overlay first, and we look at all the uses of overlay, okay, so we use our IDE here to see all the uses. We can see here that actually overlay is almost certainly should be nullable. It is set to null in a place. It uses null aware operators on it. It's checked for null. So something about the logic of this program is requiring overlay to be nullable. So we're not going to change anything about that. Animations, though, if we look at the uses of animations, we can see in one place it is set to a non-null value. The result of a constructor is definitely non-null. And all of the other places that it's used, it's passing it into places that have required parameters that are definitely non-null. So that's a good sign to this for us that this field is never actually really intended to be null, and therefore it's a great candidate to make late. Okay, so how do we make it late? Well, again, we use hints, and here we can just add it directly. We don't have a button in the tool for this, but this is one of these sort of power user hints that you can actually add directly in your code to, again, continue guiding the tool. I'll add a late hint that's going to come back here and tell the tool that when we rerun this code, it should treat animations as a late non-nullable variable and propagate all of the changes that follow through from that. So we'll get rid of a few more of these non-null assertion operators. So that's the basic workflow that we're talking about here when we talk about using the tool in an interactive mode. We look at the changes that the tool is proposing. We think about them either using the preview pane, which gives us information about the reasoning that the tool has made, or we look in our IDE to try and understand whether it's making the choices that we want it to make, and we override any choices that we don't like, and then we rerun it until we finally get something that we like. And then if we want to, we can take all, or again, some of the code and apply the migration to it. So let's go ahead and do that. We can say, well, we've just ported this feature discovery directory. We haven't looked at any of this other code yet. I want to send this out for review, so I'll uncheck everything else, okay? And then I can go ahead and apply the migration. It's going to ask me if I really want to do this. I say yes. It's going to go ahead and rewrite just the code that we just audited here on disk. So we can see here it said it's migrated a few files. It updated our pub spec to say that the whole project is opted in, and then it has marked a whole bunch of files as explicitly opted out because we haven't migrated them yet. And if we start the tool up again, it will tell us, hey, these are the files that are not migrated. These are the files that are migrated. What do you want to do with this? Okay. Okay, so that's the workflow. If I wanted to, I could now send feature discovery off for review. I could start in on the next part. I could do the whole thing in one go. With a bit of help from the migration tool, we could have this whole app up and running just without a lot of fuss. It might take us an hour or two to get something really tuned and fine. Okay, so a few things that I'd like you to take away from this. First, remember that you should only migrate when all of your dependencies are ready. We really strongly encourage this. And pub outdated -- mode equals null safety will help you figure out if you're ready or not. When pub says you're ready, go for it. If not, you need to wait. Maybe you can help migrate some of those other packages you depend on while you're waiting and get familiar with null safety. Second, when you are ready to migrate, I hope I've convinced you that the migration tool is a great option for speeding up the process. You can try using it in a one-off fashion, the way I did at the start, but we think you'll probably get a better outcome if you work with it interactively, the way we did here at the end. Finally, whether you choose to use the tool or not, I hope it's clear that migrating to null safety isn't a terrifying ordeal. Our experience is that most code is pretty straightforward to migrate, whether you're using the migration tool or just using the IDE, and we've been really quite happy with the result. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being part of the Dart and Flutter community, and happy coding.